Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. Many security strategies rely on pattern recognition, setting a benchmark for what normal operations look like, and then tracking any anomalies that could represent a potential threat. But what do you do when normal is suddenly very abnormal? Coronavirus has introduced huge disruptions to standard operating procedures, and security teams must quickly adapt to cope. I'm Carly Page, news editor of ITPro, and for this Q&A, I'll be talking to Darktrace director Mariana Pereira about the changing situation and how businesses can make sure they're not caught out. Thank you so much for joining us, Mariana.
Thank you for having me, Carly.
So, coronavirus has caused massive changes in employee behaviour, with people moving from office-based to predominantly remote roles. What impact has this had on security strategies that typically rely on things like behavioral modeling and predefined threat models?
Absolutely. This overnight shift that many of us have had to adapt to, I'd say mostly working from home, if not other new ways of working, has really been a huge opportunity for attackers to take advantage of that chaos and that moment of uncertainty, especially as security teams have had to scramble to adapt. For companies that have very static security policies or approaches that rely on predefined rules of what's permissible or what's not allowed, they saw very quickly that they had to adapt to a more adaptive mentality of cybersecurity, because suddenly so many of those policies were no longer valid and they had to really rethink the entire approach. Many companies and many of the Darktrace customers who had already embraced adaptive self-learning AI have found that they were able to secure their workforces much faster, because even though in a physical sense our world has changed overnight, from a digital behavior sense, many things have actually remained the same. And so the pattern of communications between companies and their suppliers, or even between coworkers, hasn't really changed in the digital sense. But of course, we are now, from a structure point of view, accessing many more platforms, such as collaboration platforms, video conferencing platforms, cloud tools, and so many other ecosystems at a much faster and more prevalent pace than we were before. So that's really also sped up many of those projects to digitize and virtualize those collaboration and SaaS environments that many companies already had on their roadmaps.
Absolutely. So would you say, generally speaking, are the networks we're using at home, are they less secure than business networks that often employ cyber defense measures?
Well, certainly the priority and the focus for our corporate IT teams had always been to defend the corporate network and the corporate environment. And there is absolutely now an increase in the attack surface, because corporate devices are on home networks, or even sometimes, our corporate devices are being accessed potentially by our family members or flatmates. There's definitely a bigger crossover between our personal and professional lives that weren't necessarily designed into security policies. And that's why I think this, in a way, this pandemic has really accelerated that which had been happening for many years, which is this shift away from the idea that you need security to predefine what's good, what's bad, but rather accept what belongs, what is normal, what's the accepted pattern of life, and then understand that for any given user within the bigger context and the complex context that is the digital ecosystem of any company. And so we're talking about laptops, mobile phones, but also smart sensors, IoT devices, guest networks, cloud infrastructure, all of those things that can be connected to and make up that ecosystem and can be understood not only on an individual level, but also versus their own peers. So we can start to allow the machine and our security teams to understand that normal that is never static, it's always evolving. Just that in this case, it's evolved a bit faster within a 1 week period.
Absolutely. And perhaps a bit of a strange question, but do you think these home networks that comprise of so many different types of devices, are they as attractive a target to hackers, or would they rather infiltrate a corporate network and deploy a rapid attack across that entire network?
That's a really great question. And I think that we've generally seen attackers will go for the soft underbelly or the weakest access point, whatever that is. Historically, the days of punching through well-defended firewalls is really now the stuff of Hollywood. And mostly we see attackers take advantage, one, of humans. It's relatively easy to trick a human into an inadvisable action, and especially over email. In fact, we see 94% of attacks originate via the inbox. The second thing is absolutely the attack surface now, if we think about our home networks, they might contain devices that don't have security thought in. And so especially if you think of home IoT devices, smart doorbells, smart sensors, whatever it is, if those devices have any kind of vulnerability that might also have already been published, it's very difficult to stay on top of all of those patchings, even just for something like printers. We've heard for years how wireless printers need to be constantly updated and constantly patched. So there's absolutely an ease with which an attacker can now target a home and then use that to pivot into the corporate network that is associated to that home environment.
Great. And do you think incident response, do you think that can be managed as successfully with entire teams now working from home?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the incident response teams, we've already been asking so much of them for a very long time, and it's a common thing that I hear from teams all around the world, really. There are not enough hours in the day, there are too many incidents. And so what we've been working for many years now is really using AI to help those teams not only respond to the things that are actually most critical, but actually use AI to autonomously respond to the threat and giving the team time to catch up. So one example of this might be, as we've recently seen, actually, an unusual login into a SaaS corporate environment. Now, we hypothesized that the original attack had come in via email, that somebody had managed to get into the environment by sending in an email. The user would have then fallen by clicking on the link, put in their credentials, thinking that it was a legitimate credential. The attackers then would wait to use those legitimate credentials to log into the cloud infrastructure. And of course, now that we're logging in for so many more different places, we can imagine how an attacker was thinking, oh, okay, I can more easily hide in the noise because so many more places are being accessed. Yeah. But we were still able to detect that access, and we were still able to understand that what was unusual was then that that person wasn't behaving in the way that we would have expected them to. They were accessing files that were unusual for that particular user. They were reading through outstanding invoices, and then they launched the attack from that user's email, which was cloud-based, to send to companies that had invoices outstanding a plain text message saying, hey, can you please change your bank details and make this outstanding payment to this other bank account? So this is an attack that had started via email. It really affects the cloud. It then affects multiple geographies. And of course, then the final piece of that attack is just a plain text message that is very powerful in the information that it contains. So as we think all of these adaptations, all those pivots, all the ways in which then the attack changes over their life cycle, of course, the IT teams and the security teams need to have every advantage at their disposal to be able to react at machine speeds in real time. And AI can really help us get there, to buy them time to react.
Absolutely. And I guess it looks like a huge number of organizations are going to continue working from home for the foreseeable future. So do you think now is the time that they should start taking note and adapting their business practices for the future?
Yes, I think there are many companies that we've worked with who had already set up either remote or semi-remote. I'm sorry, it sounds like there's a bit of a background construction happening just
No worries.
outside here. So for even this, as we're adapting to new ways of life,
Of course.
perfectly normal, by the way, over here. But yeah, so as we've seen, many companies had already started adapting either in their digitization journeys or in allowing more flexibility for workers. And I think the biggest thing is understanding that you need to understand what the biggest risks to your business is, and then taking steps in the priority of that. Of course, the basic hygiene of cyber hygiene, that will go very far. Be suspicious, be alert, be always conscious of the fact that attackers are trying to get a foothold in, sometimes in things that are as simple as an email message. But what we can do is help these teams and help keeping the workforces safe by enabling security teams that are high performing to be even higher performing, thanks to not only the policies, but also the technologies that allow them to enable those policies. And then what are the use cases that we're going to see out of those tools? So I think more than the tools themselves, the use cases are where we need to be thinking about.
Yeah. Great. And speaking of these new technologies, are there any industries that you noticed were more well prepared than others, sort of building up to this pandemic?
I don't think there was any industry that was really prepared for this. One thing I would say is that historically, Darktrace customers, we had seen, 2 years ago, 25% of our customer base were financial institutions, maybe because they already had the budgets and the requirements from data protection and legislation sort of incentives to get them investing in IT sooner than some of the other sectors. However, nowadays already that proportion has evened out, and we have customers and we are working with companies across every industry and every sector. Of course, even more recently, if we think about the fact that the pandemic has also started targeting or has brought segments that weren't historically, or companies that wouldn't think of themselves as being high value targets, have now become high value targets. So I'm thinking about research institutions, pharmaceutical laboratories, scientists who rely on collaboration with other scientists to be able to develop vaccines, but also keep intellectual property safe, are now being targeted also, not only by hackers, but also by foreign policies and governments who have a political advantage in getting to that vaccine first. So I think that it's, in a way, the pandemic has really just brought another aspect by which the geopolitical tensions around hacking, the advantages around information theft, the dangers around identity compromise have just brought that home to many more users at an individual level.
Great. And I know we've already mentioned quite a lot about phishing attacks. You said AI technology is becoming more accessible to businesses, but we've seen reports that technology is also becoming more accessible to hackers. Is AI-powered spear phishing attacks and automated attacks, is that something that should be on businesses' radar at the moment?
Yeah, absolutely, because it is already happening. So earlier this year, with the start of the pandemic, we had detected a rise in the increase of COVID-related phishing attacks. So either information from the WHO or information purporting to be from the WHO or the CDC or other health agencies. Then we started seeing actually that the conversations and the topics were moving one adjacency away. So in England, we saw an increase of furlough-related notifications. In the United States, it's all, the tax season has extended, and we recently found a phishing attack that pretended to be from an Intuit invoice from QuickBooks. So the attackers are very much on top of the evolving topics. And the other thing also is that we've seen evidence to suggest that they are automating those processes. So they're automatically purchasing domains to then launch these attacks and really scale them up. The other aspect of this is, if we think about it, they're pretty standard, bulk spray and pray attacks. The real danger, and one of the hardest types of attacks to identify and stop, are the ones that are instead much more subtle. Maybe they're compromising one person's accounts. Maybe then that attacker spends time reading the previous correspondence to mimic the style of tone, of voice, of communication. And we already have AI that is pretty good at mimicking human interactions. So AI-powered spear phishing is something that we're discussing. It's not really a distant future. It's one thing that we need to be contending with already now, as all of these tools are accessible, as you said very rightly, to businesses, but also to the attackers.
Great. And with these email scams becoming more and more advanced, how do we teach our employees to be able to spot them? Like, what are the telltale signs of these attacks?
Well, definitely we can sometimes identify that there are some typos, that something just doesn't feel quite right, either in the visual or even in the content of the email. Tone, grammatical errors, those are giveaways. But the reality is that we're so busy that we are often not stopping to proofread incoming mail. So then the next thing is, does it feel right? If something's too good to be true, it likely isn't true. But there is no way really to train our way out of this. We can't expect humans to be able to identify and stop attacks on their own, especially when we're up against an adversary that is well-funded and they themselves are using AI. So I think that not only we all have of course, a responsibility to ourselves and to our companies to challenge and really think before we click, but also all the companies are investing in policies, are really thinking about how to keep the workers' inboxes safe, the cloud environment safe, because these are now the place of work, when before it was an office, it's these digital ecosystems. And I think that AI really has an advantage here, because what we've seen is, and again, with so many of our customers going to an overnight new way of working, but we've seen that the AI has been able to keep up with that and to keep up with those changes and understand the new normal. And that's really powerful and very important. Also, I should mention that not all AIs are the same. Ours is unsupervised a machine learning that powers our artificial intelligence and is always adapting and learning directly on the live environment, in the live data. And so it was able to adapt. And so I would say to anyone, though, who is thinking about how can we make sure that we are investing in the right tools, yes, training is hugely important, but as is finding the tools that are going to give you the visibility and the understanding of the context of what's happening. For many years also, we've seen siloed approaches. So cloud security dealt with cloud, email security dealt with email, firewall security, we had antiviruses, and all these various siloed and different products and approaches that dealt with one aspect. And more than ever, I think we need to be understanding that the ecosystem has gone far more complex than being able to deal with these point solutions, and understanding the digital ecosystem as a whole.
Absolutely. And I know earlier you mentioned a phishing attack that you and your team spotted. Do you have any other examples you could share with us about how this technology is helping to prevent these cases that are going on right now?
Yeah, so we were talking about this attack that was a invoice, pretending to be an invoice from Intuit and QuickBooks. And essentially what had happened was that the company that was hit actually legitimately used the product. So we were able to spot very clearly that these were spoofed attacks, because the AI was able to discern, okay, well, we even know what it's supposed to look like. So that was even easier. But one of the things that I find very interesting was a situation where we have unusual that is understood to be non-threatening. And I think that kind of subtle distinction is very important, because we're still allowing businesses to grow and to do new things, right? Newness with policies never go well together, because if you're setting policies that allow you to work in a specific way, then you need to rewrite them every time something's new. So in one particular example, actually, which happened to me, where I was looking for new ways to, a new thank you gift, actually it was, a new thank you gift that I wanted to send for a corporate setting. And I personally also love patch.com, so I'm going to give them a little shout out here. Sending plans, we've got some nice plants in the background. So I had gone to this website to check out, what I could send or what kind of plans they had, and I signed up to the newsletter. Now, it had turned out that I was apparently the first person at Darktrace to have done that. And so when the newsletter from patch.com arrived, the AI had actually thought that that was very unusual. No one else had ever received correspondence from them. If that had been a rule, I would have never received my 15% off or £5 off coupon, whatever it was. But the AI was also able to understand in the context that comes before that email arriving. Well, actually, I had navigated to their website. I had interacted with that domain. I had had an exchange of information with that domain. And so we're able to contextualize these things. So unusual doesn't necessarily mean bad. And that's why I think it's so important that we're shifting the conversation away from good and bad and accept that in this new normal, we're really thinking, does it belong? And have that system ask the same questions that we would be asking ourselves. Does this make sense? Does it belong? Is it explainable? And am I okay to allow this to continue? Or if it's the inverse, even if it's with legitimate credentials, hey, that's a little bit odd. Why on earth is Mariana receiving patch.com emails?
Great. I think you've just answered my next question, really, but I'm interested to hear your thoughts. So I guess a lot of AI models being used in these kind of ways at the moment, they will have been trained pre-coronavirus. Are a lot of AI models going to struggle now with the rapid way the world has changed in the past couple of months?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. And it really goes to the heart of how artificial intelligence and machine learning can be very different in its various applications. So anytime that you're teaching a computer what is normal or what is good or what is bad, and you're sort of putting a label on it and you're saying this is okay, then of course that's what it's learning. With Darktrace and with our unsupervised machine learning approach, really what we've allowed the machine to do is to say, all right, here is the environment, and we allow the math to work out amongst thousands of little markers of metadata and patterns of behavior and communications what that normality is like. And so whenever then we have a big systematic change, one of the things that we've noticed is, yes, it was suddenly unusual for us to be connecting from home environments or from different IP addresses. But actually, when we look at what the users were doing once they had connected, that wasn't so different. So one of the things that we did do, actually, and we worked with our customers, is to very quickly update the understanding because we saw a lot of threats coming in through VPN or misuse of VPN networks. And so a lot of our customers very quickly realized that that was the vulnerability that they needed to be paying more attention to. And so that response was also possible thanks to the fact that we had that visibility and very quick understanding of how the threat had shifted overnight. And so we were able also to very quickly just say to the security teams, all right, well, because we understand how the AI understands your world and it's not a black box, we're now able to target the responses and target the attention in those things that we are seeing be the new risk factors.
Great. Speaking of new risk factors, we've spoke quite a lot about phishing attacks. Are there any other methods you've observed hackers exploiting during this crisis?
Yes, well, we've seen. Oh, goodness, unfortunately, it's one of those things that with email, it's definitely sort of crowned the use of fearware, which is a very unfortunate situation where they basically prey on fear, uncertainty, and doubt and use those to feed into those email campaigns. I was in a panel recently, just a couple of weeks ago, in which I was then told of the use case, which is the inverse. Attackers relying on romantic scams. And actually exactly on the other side of that equation is good news, you've won this, or somebody is trying to contact you via this dating app, which apparently is on the rise in Holland. The other thing that I think is still very quiet, but we will be seeing a rise in soon, is the fact that, remember, many attacks actually take many months to be discovered or to be leveraged. So there might be many situations where attackers have a foothold into an organization or an ecosystem, but are waiting for the right moment to strike. And so more than ever, that behavioral analysis, the understanding of the person, of the worker, and of the pattern of life between those people is going to be critical to spot those attackers that think that they can hide in the new confusion, in the chaos, or in the new changes. They hopefully won't be able to. And that will depend very much on the ability of the teams to spot those anomalies and stop them before they have a chance to develop into data leaks or full crises. And that's also something that I think that we sometimes think, what's happening now, and we don't think about what has happened before or what might be coming next. But that's because we get tired. And that's a huge other advantage that the AI has, is the more data and the more context you give it, the better it can perform. So absolutely, it's going to be a game changer as we think about other types of attacks.
Great. And I know most of us are still working remotely at the moment, but businesses are going to start returning to the offices now, soon. Does this pose a potential security risk? Could hackers potentially take advantage of this?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things, we were talking earlier about chaos and insecurities and confusion. Those are all moments in which attackers take advantage to enter. So sometimes have this ideas for some great Hollywood movies, probably, or some movies in general. Actually, it doesn't need to be Hollywood. But the imposter who steals your card and masks and pretends to be you because there are new people in the office who maybe hadn't seen you. Maybe that you'll present yourself as a new worker and go in. If we think of what that looks like in the digital ecosystem, it's in a way easier and harder to do, to fool other people. But as then things are going to shift again, we're going to see a secondary shift of what normal looks like. But sometimes we think about these sort of big changes as a point in time. But let's remember that for many companies, dealing with change is a constant and daily challenge, and they need to be able to keep that security level high throughout those changes. So when I think also about companies that have to deal with supply chains, and yes, of course, the pandemic has had a huge impact and huge amount of disruption across the entire supply chain. Let's also remember that they're dealing with changes in the way that they operate whenever there's a natural disaster, if a volcano erupts. So being able to adapt to change, I think, is by definition the new normal of the 21st century. But we're now seeing it not only in supply chain, we're seeing it in manufacturing, we're seeing it in information technology, we're seeing it in entertainment and in sports and everything else. So the questions that we should be asking ourselves, and especially as we approach security, and not just cybersecurity, but are, I think, going to be much more collaborative and much more enabling of businesses to be able to change over time, rather than that restrictive mentality of saying yes, no, because the policy dictates. So I also think that this is going to be a great situation where security teams and workers in general are going to have a greater appreciation and understanding of the security concerns, how they can play a part in keeping their businesses safe, and also their personal digital lives.
Absolutely. On the point of collaboration, do you think this situation may have been a good thing for trust between security departments and their employees? Because obviously they're all now having to access this confidential data from home, and there needs to be a certain level of understanding there.
Yeah, and I think the word trust is also very interesting, because we often hear about zero trust environments, and of course then the leveraging of the trust of the sender. So the built-in trust between people is a huge aspect of being able to then carry out an attack successfully, if you're able to be trusted by your victim. But yes, I've always had and I think that the people on this event, also all of our viewers, we are all the people who probably are already ahead of that sort of curve of understanding and empathizing with our security teams. But I definitely think that the rest of the ecosystem and the rest of our businesses are going to start having a new found appreciation for the work that is done.
Absolutely. And I guess we've spoken quite a lot about the challenges that businesses face going forward. But do you think the current situation is actually a great opportunity for companies, particularly those who may have been lacking a little when it came to cybersecurity?
Yeah, sorry, it sounds like they've started up again the works outside. I hope you can still hear me okay. Yeah, I
Yeah.
think this is it's an excellent opportunity, not only to think about cybersecurity, but also to be thinking and already embracing the most advanced tools that are available. So historically, we've seen the market change over time as they fell in and out of love with various tools and approaches. What I would say to anyone who's looking at AI technologies nowadays and considering deploying those technologies is really to challenge those in your own environment and find companies that are going to have a partnership with you and help you get as much value out of your tools as possible in all of those different use cases. But most importantly, something that I must say, like Darktrace, that can, of course, be deployed very quickly and very quickly bring you value and visibility, rather than spending months or weeks with configurations and then IT problems that you'll then have to backtrack and resolve. With AI, there is so much in so many different ways and so many different approaches to be able to implement AI-powered technologies. And so I think we need to be asking ourselves, all right, which one's the most correct one for the use case that I'm trying to resolve? And whether that is starting with cloud or starting with email or starting on the network as a whole, understanding that that needs to then be part of a bigger picture, of a holistic and complex, comprehensive understanding of the security and of the people who work for you and with you. Which also makes me think about securing partners and suppliers, right? Like, we can be secure, but then how can our security help those collaborations? So one story that came to mind just now, actually, if we still have time for it, is
Absolutely.
an attack. Okay, it was an attack that we found in a company in Italy. And what had happened was that their sister company had been compromised and their infrastructure was being used to send out an attack. Now, because we were working with one of the sister companies, the company we were working with, even if it was a proof of value, they weren't even a customer of ours at the time, we were able to identify that their sister company was interacting or was reaching out to them in an unusual way. And so we called them up and said, look, are you aware of the fact that these things are happening? And they weren't. We had a situation back 2 years ago with Metro Labs in the United States, where during their proof of value, we called them up and said, hey, is it normal for you to be seeing traffic from Russia? And Jimmy Gelhar also says in an interview, he was saying, this is not likely to be the case. This seems like too good a moment for them to have found it in the 3 weeks that I happened to be trying them out. But in fact, we were able to have him log in. This happened over the weekend, and we were able to work with him over the weekend to find these unusual connections and this unusual communication that was happening between his infrastructure and then an IP address that appeared to be originating from Russia. So all of these things, all of these attacks, all of these moments, all of these threat stories that we find, they're just, I think they show also how hard it is to really think, that you're perfectly secure, or it's not an admission of the fact that it's an impossible challenge or that they're not doing it correctly, but really that the attackers have found ways around the existing defenses. And so the existing tools, while they're great and they go a long way, are not sufficient.
Great. And I think we have time for a couple more questions. It might seem like a bit of an odd time for companies to be completely overhauling their cybersecurity practices with new AI systems and tools like that. So how would you recommend they proceed?
Oh, that's an excellent question. So first of all, I would say proceed by testing it in areas that are representative of the real world. Whenever we try new tools and we use them in a test environment, we need to be thinking of that test environment as a sample of what real life is like, and really asking what we're trying to get out of that experience. For many companies, though, this is a very good moment to be having conversations not only about risk and security, but also in terms of the new legislations. Some time ago, everything was about GDPR. And now with the California Privacy Act, a lot of conversations are about the regulations and checking boxes. But so many companies have also found that these are excellent moments to have a reflection about what is it that they're trying to achieve as a strategic and as a future goal. What is it that security can provide apart from keeping things safe? What are the other sort of unintended consequences? And one of the things that I find really interesting working with customers is the unintended consequences of that visibility. So I'm thinking here, for instance, one was a company that was able to understand which one of their users were the ones that were the most at risk because they're being targeted. Now, we sometimes think that board members, executives who has profiles on the website, yes, of course, they're being targeted all the time. But it's been really interesting to see sometimes how procurement officers who aren't advertised on corporate websites, how they're being targeted. And so that education piece, we don't need to be retraining the entire workforce. We just need to be understanding who's most at risk, who's the most vulnerable, and help those individuals out. Another sort of side effect, which I thought was interesting from a publishing house, they told me, was that he really appreciated understanding how the environments were being used and how workers were accessing, but also with what volume workers were accessing certain environments. And so this was a very sort of techie benefit, but that he was able to really understand also the loads on the network and how he could better optimize those channels. And so to open up more bandwidth for where it was needed, restrict it where it wasn't in use. And so actually give some efficiencies from a business perspective and from a cost savings. And those aren't things that are directly or usually thought of in the context of cybersecurity, but are very real benefits to the business. A whole area of cybersecurity is also propping up around the notion that if you can understand really where your risk is from, you don't need to be taking the same approach with two companies to underwrite their risk profiles just because they happen to be the same size or they're in the same industry. But you can really understand how their setups, how their infrastructure exposes them to more or less risk on the basis of that visibility and that understanding. So now suddenly we've got also a whole other area, which is how does the visibility and how can AI help you in staying safer, but also then the added benefit on the cyber insurance aspect. I've mentioned supply chains with sister companies. That also brings a huge level of collaboration and visibility into being able to safely conduct a business. So I think that all of this really, what it does is it puts it into motion, a conversation that was historically kept to the IT team, really to a boardroom and business level to think, how can we use this tool to get a better understanding of our company? And how can we then respond and prepare for whatever comes next by really understanding where we are now and getting that understanding at a much more granular level rather than trying to interpret logs and and dashboards, and actually get to the bottom of what is happening.
Absolutely. And this will be my final question, but you have just touched on this, but do you think now is the time that businesses need to ensure they're fully prepared if a situation like this were to happen again in the future?
Yes, and depending who you ask, there are different opinions as to whether or not this will happen again in the future, but definitely preparedness is now going to be key. Whether it happens or not, it might not be another pandemic, but it might be some other type of disruption. The opportunity that we have now is to really embrace technologies that allow us to navigate uncertainty and disruptions in a way that before it was a good to have, it's now absolutely critical. Especially because the attackers aren't sitting around. They're taking advantage of any moment of disruption, and they will most certainly take advantage of the next disruption, even if the next disruption is, and I use air quotes here, going back to normal, whatever that means. So these, we were just, I think the other day there was an interview, or it's coming up, there's an event with the CEO of McLaren Racing that we're a sponsor of. And McLaren Racing for sure is one of the, if not Formula One as being the most high-tech sport I think that there is out there. So I'm personally excited to see them back on the piste or whenever that happens. But how also for them, it's been for every company, actually, not just if you're racing, if you're a fast-moving consumer good, if you're manufacturing or utilities, we've had this opportunity to really rethink whether the approach that we've taken so far is the right approach to continue with. And very rarely are we given such a moment to really reflect as to whether what we've been doing all along is really the thing that's going to help us for the next 5, 10, 20 years. But even before the next 5, 10, 20 years, we need to be worried about next year, because some of these attacks that I've mentioned that are being powered by AI, that are learning and are stealthily listening in and mimicking our way of business, that's stuff that's happening right now. And a lot of companies don't have the tools in place that would be able to help them identify that. So it's a brilliant moment. It's an excellent opportunity to try it out, really see for yourselves how you can be supercharging your security teams so that the teams that were already high performing are going to be even more high performing. One of the areas that I often hear, there's this duality as to AI, will it take away our jobs? Is it going to do our jobs for us? And we've spoken for years about the skills shortage that exists in this space. We can really use tools to help us lower that barrier so that the gap isn't so big. So rather than thinking we need to be upskilling everyone, is the idea of using AI and technology to make the problem a bit more human friendly so that more of us can be in that pool to be fighting back and helping in the defense.
Absolutely. Mariana, thank you so much for joining us. I'm sure our viewers will agree. That's been really fascinating.